My name is Jordan. I didn't grow up in skyscrapers or luxury mansions. I grew up in a tiny house where every dollar was stretched, and sometimes the fridge echoed with emptiness. But it was in that silence of poverty that the fire of my destiny was lit. Today, they call me a billionaire of Wall Street, but the truth is, my empire began with nothing more than hunger, broken shoes, and a dream bigger than my circumstances. Have you ever wondered how someone with no inheritance, no powerful family name, no contacts, can rise to the top of Wall Street? My journey wasn't built on luck, but on painful choices, ruthless discipline, and an obsession, decoding the secrets of money that the rich never wanted to share. In this episode, I'll reveal how it all started, the day a poor boy found an old newspaper and hidden inside it the doorway to Wall Street. Stay until the end, because this is not just my story. It might be the map that could change yours too. My name is Jordan. Before I ever saw a stock chart, before I ever wore a suit, before anyone ever called me a billionaire, I was just a boy born into scarcity. I grew up in a neighborhood where broken sidewalks carried more stories of survival than of success. The paint on our house peeled with every winter storm, and inside, the air was heavy with both love and struggle. My parents worked hard, harder than anyone I knew, yet no matter how many hours they gave to their jobs, there was always more month than money. I still remember nights when the hum of the refrigerator felt louder than the food inside it. Some evenings it was almost empty, except for a jar of peanut butter, a few eggs, or leftovers stretched into something that resembled dinner. My mother had the gift of making scarcity look like enough, but even as a child, I could sense the silent battle she fought each day. Shoes in our house were passed down, not bought. I wore sneakers that once belonged to my older brother, soles so thin that the cold of the pavement seeped through them. But those shoes carried me through streets that taught me about hunger, not just the hunger in my stomach, but a hunger in my soul. That hunger whispered to me, there must be more than this. There must be a way out. I didn't know what that way was, but I knew I would spend my life searching for it. As a boy, I watched other kids get dropped off in shiny cars, their backpacks stuffed with new gadgets and lunches wrapped neatly in plastic. I envied them, not because of what they had, but because they seemed free of the invisible chains that weighed on my family. Poverty is more than the absence of money. It is the constant reminder that you are trapped. And I hated that feeling. One day, while taking out the trash for a neighbor, I found an old newspaper folded and stained with grease. Most kids would have ignored it, but something made me pick it up. I opened it randomly, and my eyes landed on a section filled with numbers, arrows, and strange words I didn't understand. Dow Jones, S&P 500, dividends, stocks. I didn't know it then, but that single page was my first glimpse into a world that would one day define my life. At first, it felt like reading a foreign language, but I stared at it for hours, tracing the columns with my finger, trying to decode the mystery. Why did some numbers go up while others went down? Why did people care about these arrows? Why did they call this the market? That night, something shifted inside me. I realized that behind those numbers was power. Power to build, to escape, to rewrite a destiny. Weeks later, at the public library, I searched for more. I wasn't looking for stories about superheroes or adventures. I was looking for secrets about money. That's when I stumbled on a book that mentioned Warren Buffett. His name struck me like lightning. Here was a man who didn't come from royalty. who didn't invent some miracle product, but who became one of the richest men alive simply by understanding those same numbers I had seen in the paper. One quote of his became my anchor: "The best investment you can make is in yourself." I copied those words into the back of an old notebook and carried them with me like scripture. I didn't understand all the mechanics of investing yet, but I understood this: if Buffett could do it, so could I. I started practicing with fake money, writing down imaginary investments in my notebook. I'd pick a company from the paper, track it for weeks, and calculate what I would have gained or lost. At school, while others doodled superheroes in the margins of their notebooks, I was sketching out stock charts, arrows, and numbers. Of course, no one took me seriously. To my friends, I was just the weird kid with numbers. But every night, when I lay down in that cramped bedroom I shared with my brother, I promised myself, I will not die poor. I will not stay trapped here. One day, I will walk into Wall Street, and they will know my name. Poverty shapes you in two ways. It either convinces you that you're destined to stay small, or it lights a fire that refuses to go out. For me, it was the fire. Every empty fridge, every torn shoe, every whispered argument between my parents about bills became fuel. I wasn't just studying numbers, I was studying escape routes. I knew it wouldn't be easy. People like me didn't get invited into the halls of power. But I decided early on that I didn't need an invitation. I would break down the door if I had to. Looking back now, I can say this: poverty gave me my first and most important investment, the hunger to change my life. That hunger was my capital. That hunger was my leverage. That hunger was the reason that one day I would no longer read about billionaires in the paper. I would become one. This was the beginning of my journey. And as I tell you my story, remember this: what looks impossible today can become inevitable tomorrow, if you are willing to learn, to fail, and to rise again. My name is Jordan, and this is the legacy of a tycoon. I was 14 when I got my first job. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't some genius internship or a lucky connection. It was at a corner grocery store, stacking shelves and sweeping floors. My hands smelled like cardboard and dust, and at the end of each week, I would take home a paycheck so small it could barely cover bus fare and a few snacks. But to me, that paycheck was gold. For the first time in my life, I had money that was mine, earned by my sweat, by my effort. I didn't spend it the way other kids did. While my friends blew their cash on video games or fast food, I saved every dollar. I wasn't saving for clothes or shoes, I was saving for knowledge. At the back of that same grocery store, they sold old second-hand books for pennies. One day, I found a worn-out copy of The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham. The cover was torn, the pages smelled like mildew, but inside it held the world I had been searching for. I bought it with 2 weeks' worth of pay. That book became my Bible. Every night, after work and after homework, I would sit on the edge of my bed under the dim yellow light of a lamp and read. I didn't understand everything. Some pages felt like riddles written in another universe. But piece by piece, concept by concept, I began to stitch together a vision, value, margin of safety, patience. These were not just words, they were weapons. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. My parents worried about me. They thought I was wasting time with fantasies. My friends laughed. They called me Wall Street Jordan as a joke, mocking me with fake accents and fake stock tips in the schoolyard. I smiled, but deep down, I stored their laughter like fuel. The truth is, they couldn't understand. They didn't feel the hunger that I felt when I opened an empty fridge. They didn't lie awake at night, listening to their parents argue about overdue bills. They didn't feel the shame of saying no to school trips because money was too tight. I wasn't chasing numbers. I was chasing freedom. At 16, I had saved enough to make my first real investment. It wasn't much, just a few $100s I had scraped together from odd jobs and long shifts at the grocery store. I opened a small account with a brokerage firm that barely looked at me twice. To them, I was just a kid. To me, I was stepping onto the battlefield. I chose a small company I had read about in the paper. I didn't know much about balance sheets or earnings reports back then, but I believed I had found something others overlooked. I put in all my money. For a few weeks, the stock climbed. I thought I was a genius. I walked around with my chest puffed out, convinced I was the next Warren Buffett. But then, just as quickly, it crashed. I lost almost everything. That moment broke me. I remember staring at the numbers on the screen, my heart pounding, my stomach turning as if I had swallowed fire. All my hard work, my saving, my sacrifice gone in a blink. I felt like a fool. For days, I carried the weight of that loss like a stone chained to my neck. I wanted to quit. I wanted to believe the voices that told me I was wasting my time. But then, I remembered something from Graham's book. The investor's chief problem, and even his worst enemy, is likely to be himself. It wasn't the market that had beaten me. It was my impatience, my arrogance. I had wanted to get rich fast, and the market punished me for it. That failure became my first real lesson. Money doesn't reward desperation. It rewards discipline. So I went back to the library. I went back to the books. I studied balance sheets, earnings, dividends. I stopped chasing quick wins and started learning the art of waiting. I realized that the market was not a casino, it was a weighing machine. And if I could learn how to weigh correctly, time would be my ally. At 17, while my classmates dreamed of prom and summer vacations, I dreamed of Wall Street. I imagined myself walking between skyscrapers, not as a tourist, but as a player. Every shift at the grocery store, every coin I saved, every page I read it was all preparation. Sometimes, when customers at the store handed me crumpled bills, I would look at the money differently. To them, it was change. To me, it was possibility. Every dollar was a seed, and I had decided that my life's mission was to plant those seeds until I grew a forest so vast that no storm could destroy it. I failed again, of course. My next 2 investments didn't go much better, but each failure hurt less, not because I lost less money, but because I gained more wisdom. I was slowly transforming my mind from that of a gambler to that of an investor. The hunger never left me. In fact, the failures only sharpened it. I promised myself I would never again put money into something I didn't fully understand. I would never again confuse luck with skill. I would never again let impatience rob me of my future. Looking back now, I realize those years were not about money at all. They were about character. The market didn't just shape my portfolio, it shaped me. I learned discipline sweeping grocery aisles. I learned resilience losing my first investment. I learned patience turning the fragile pages of books that smelled older than my grandfather. And slowly, piece by piece, I was building the foundation of something far bigger than I could imagine. Those were my first steps into the world of investing. And though they were filled with stumbles and setbacks, they set me on a path that would one day lead me to Wall Street's highest towers. My name is Jordan, and this is my legacy. If Block 2 was about my first bruises, Block 3 was about how those bruises turned into armor. After losing almost everything in my first reckless investment, something changed inside me. I no longer chased the thrill of quick wins. I no longer wanted to gamble. I wanted mastery. I began to treat investing not as a game, but as a craft. And like every craft, it demanded obsession. I made the library my second home. The old librarian, Mrs. Harkins, used to joke that she saw me more often than her own grandchildren. Week after week, I'd walk in with my notebook tucked under my arm, hungry to devour anything that had a chart, a balance sheet, or a lesson on business. At first, the language of finance was overwhelming. Terms like compound interest, book value, intrinsic worth, they felt like mountains too steep to climb. But slowly, word by word, I conquered them. I didn't just read, I rewrote concepts into my own words, filling entire notebooks with explanations and drawings. One habit defined those years. I forced myself to read 500 pages a week. It was brutal. It meant saying no to parties, no to television, no to idle afternoons. My friends thought I was boring. My parents thought I was obsessed. But I knew what I was building. Page after page, something remarkable began to happen. My mind started to change. I no longer looked at companies as mysterious names in a newspaper. I saw them as living organisms. I studied how they breathed, how they earned, how they survived downturns. I learned to spot which were strong and which were sick. And then came the magic of compounding. I realized that money, when given patience, didn't just grow, it multiplied. It was like planting an apple seed that not only grew into a tree, but one day produced an entire orchard. That single idea changed the way I saw time. No longer was I desperate to make money fast. I wanted to make money forever. Around this time, I began paper trading again imaginary investments in my notebooks. But this time, I wasn't guessing. I was calculating. I would study a company for weeks, sometimes months, before pretending to buy it. I tracked it daily, wrote notes on why it moved, and compared my predictions to reality. One of those companies was a small manufacturing firm that made farm equipment. Everyone around me ignored it, too boring, too slow. But I saw something in its numbers. Strong assets, low debt, consistent profits. In my notebook, I wrote, if I had $1,000, I'd put it here and never touch it for 5 years. Months later, that stock doubled in real life. I had no money in it, but in my mind, I felt like I had won. It wasn't about the profit, it was about the validation. I was learning to see what others didn't. By the time I turned 18, discipline wasn't just a word, it was my lifestyle. Every morning before school, I woke up an hour early to read financial news. Every lunch break, I scribbled notes about companies. Every night, while others were out chasing girls or drinking at parties, I sat under that same yellow lamp, reading and rereading Buffett's letters to shareholders. Sometimes I wondered if I was missing out on my youth. But then I would think about my father's tired eyes after a 12-hour shift. I would think about my mother stretching leftovers into meals, and I would whisper to myself, I'm not missing out. I'm buying my future. It was during this period that I tasted my first real victory. With a small sum I had saved from years of part-time work, I invested in a company that produced household cleaning products. It wasn't flashy. Nobody was talking about it. But I had done the math. I saw stability, growth, and most importantly, a margin of safety. For months, the stock did nothing. Friends mocked me. "Jordan, you should have put that money in something exciting. Tech stocks are booming." But I stayed patient. And then, slowly, like a seed breaking the soil, it began to climb. 10%, 20%, 30%. Within a year, my investment had nearly doubled. It wasn't billions, not even close. But it was proof. Proof that patience worked. Proof that the lessons I bled for were real. Proof that I could do this. That moment did more than grow my account, it grew my identity. I stopped seeing myself as a poor kid pretending to be an investor. I started seeing myself as a real one. I carried myself differently. I walked with more confidence. And yet, I also carried a quiet humility, because I knew how easily arrogance could destroy me. The market had already taught me that. Looking back now, I see those years as the forging of steel. Every book, every failure, every small win, they weren't random events. They were bricks, and I was laying the foundation of an empire I couldn't yet see. This was the birth of my discipline. The moment I realized wealth was not about luck or timing, but about patience, knowledge, and restraint. From this point forward, I was no longer just surviving poverty. I was learning to build my way out of it. If hunger was my first teacher and discipline was my second, then fear was my third. Not the kind of fear you feel when you hear a noise in the dark, but the kind that whispers inside your mind when no one else is listening. Even as I began to understand the market, even as I stacked small victories, there was always a voice inside me saying, "Who do you think you are, Jordan? You're just a poor kid. Wall Street isn't made for people like you." Fear wasn't just in my head. It was in my house, too. My parents didn't understand my obsession. To them, success was measured by stability, not risk. My father wanted me to become an electrician. "At least then," he said, "you'll always have work. Stocks are just gambling, Jordan. Don't waste your life." My mother worried even more. She saw me reading late at night, my eyes red from hours under the lamp, my notebooks filled with numbers and predictions. "Why don't you be like other boys?" she asked softly. "Why don't you go out, find a safe job, settle down?" I loved them for wanting to protect me, but they couldn't see what I saw. They couldn't feel the fire that burned inside me every time I studied a balance sheet or discovered a company no one else cared about. To them, I was playing with illusions. To me, I was holding the key to freedom. The pressure didn't come only from family. My friends, the few I still had left, mocked me constantly. They wanted to talk about sports, parties, and girls. I wanted to talk about dividends, debt ratios, and compound interest. "Jordan, man, you're wasting your youth," one of them said. "Even if you make money, you'll be too old to enjoy it." I laughed it off, but deep down, their words hit me. Sometimes late at night, I wondered if they were right. What if I was wasting my best years chasing a dream that would never come true? What if, after all the reading and saving and sacrificing, I still ended up poor? That doubt was poison. It tried to slow me down. It tried to slow me down. It tried to slow me down. It tried to convince me to quit. But then, I remembered something Buffett once said. "Be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful." Those words didn't just apply to stocks, they applied to life. Everyone around me was greedy for comfort, greedy for quick pleasures. I chose to be greedy for knowledge, greedy for patience, greedy for a future only I could see. Still, fear had sharp claws. The first time I invested a larger sum money I had saved for years, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, imagining every scenario. What if the company collapsed? What if I lost it all again? What if this time I wouldn't recover? I remember pacing the floor of my room at 3 in the morning, whispering to myself, "Discipline, Jordan. Discipline." I repeated it like a prayer until exhaustion finally carried me to sleep. And when I woke up, I checked the numbers again, heart pounding. The stock hadn't moved much. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I hadn't let fear control me. But the greatest enemy wasn't fear or doubt. It was the temptation to quit. At 19, after years of grinding, I still wasn't rich. I wasn't even close. I had a few thousand in savings, a portfolio that grew slowly, and notebooks filled with theories. Meanwhile, others my age were enjoying life, traveling, getting new cars, living without the weight I carried. More than once, I thought about walking away, just getting a normal job, paying bills, and accepting my place in the world. But every time I came close, I would remember the refrigerator of my childhood, the silence of poverty, the shame in my parents' eyes. That memory kept me going. Quitting would have meant betraying the boy who once found that greasy newspaper and dared to dream. And I couldn't betray him. So I learned to live with my enemies. Fear, doubt, and pressure became my companions. They walked beside me, but I refused to let them lead me. I realized something powerful. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is action despite fear. Every time I invested, every time I said no to comfort, every time I endured mockery, I was building a muscle stronger than money. I was building resilience. And resilience, I would later learn, is the currency that every billionaire secretly carries. These were my invisible battles, the nights of doubt, the mornings of fear, the pressure of voices telling me to stop. But I didn't stop, because I knew that if I could conquer the enemies inside me, no enemy outside could ever defeat me. My name is Jordan, and this is my legacy. The day I left my hometown, I carried nothing but a single suitcase and a heart full of restless ambition. Inside that suitcase were a few shirts, a pair of worn-out shoes, and my notebooks. Those notebooks filled with numbers, predictions, and dreams. They were the only proof that I wasn't just a poor kid chasing illusions. They were my weapons. When the bus rolled into New York City, I pressed my forehead against the window and stared at the skyline. The skyscrapers rose like giants, their glass reflecting the sun with a brilliance that felt almost unreal. Somewhere in those towers, fortunes were being made and lost in seconds. Somewhere in those towers, decisions were being taken that could shape entire economies. And somewhere in those towers, I promised myself a kid named Jordan would one day belong. But New York did not welcome me with open arms. The city was a storm cloud, crowded, relentless. The sidewalks overflowed with people moving faster than I had ever seen. Yellow taxis honked. Traders in suits hurried past me with phones glued to their ears, and I felt like a stranger in a language I barely spoke. I found a cheap room in a run-down apartment building. The walls were thin, the radiator clanged at night, and the cockroaches acted like they paid rent. But it was mine. It was my base camp at the foot of the mountain I was determined to climb. My first attempt to step into the world of finance was humbling. I walked into brokerage offices and investment firms dressed in my second-hand suit, carrying a resume that was thinner than the paper it was printed on. Most of them didn't even look at me twice. One receptionist smirked and said, "We don't take interns off the street." Another manager glanced at my resume for less than a second before handing it back. But rejection didn't break me, it sharpened me. Each no reminded me of who I was, a nobody trying to enter a world built for the elite. But each no also reminded me of who I wanted to be, a name that could never again be ignored. Finally, I got a chance. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even close to Wall Street itself. I found a small investment office uptown willing to take me as an unpaid intern. My job was to fetch coffee, make copies, and organize dusty files. I wasn't analyzing billion-dollar deals. I wasn't giving investment advice. I was invisible, but invisibility has its advantages. While I delivered coffee, I listened. While I filed reports, I read them. While I sat quietly in the corner of meetings, I studied every word, every expression, every hesitation of the men who called themselves players. At night, I would go back to my tiny room, exhausted but alive. I would rewrite everything I had heard that day into my notebooks. Why one trader sounded confident about a stock, why another hesitated, what news moved the room. Piece by piece, I was decoding the psychology of money. The contrast between me and the world I was entering was brutal. I would walk into the office wearing my worn suit, while others wore tailored Armani and Rolex watches that cost more than my entire savings. They drove sleek cars while I counted coins for subway fare. They went to lunches in expensive restaurants while I ate peanut butter sandwiches at my desk. But instead of feeling small, I felt sharpened. Each reminder of what I didn't have fueled me. Every shiny watch, every tailored suit, every dismissive smirk, it all became proof of what I was chasing. Then came the moment I'll never forget. One evening, long after everyone had left the office, I stayed behind to finish filing reports. As I worked, I stumbled upon a binder filled with past investment memos. I shouldn't have been reading them. They weren't meant for interns. But curiosity overcame caution. Inside those pages, I saw how decisions were made. The analysis, the risks, the biases. Some memos celebrated wins, others explained painful losses. For the first time, I realized that even the giants of finance weren't gods. They were flawed humans making bets with confidence and fear, just like me. That night, as I walked back to my apartment under the flickering streetlights, I whispered to myself, "They're not invincible. If they can do this, so can I." The city tested me in every way. Rent was hard to pay. Some nights I skipped meals just to stretch my dollars. I wore the same suit until the fabric grew thin. And there were mornings when I looked in the mirror and asked myself if I was crazy. But then I remembered the boy who once found a greasy newspaper in the trash. The boy who copied Buffett's quote into a notebook. The boy who swore he wouldn't die poor. That memory kept me alive. This was my arrival in New York. My first invisible footsteps on Wall Street's doorstep. I wasn't a billionaire yet. I wasn't even close. But I was there. And that, in itself, was a victory. I still remember the smell of that office-burnt coffee, paper, and the faint cologne of men who thought they owned the world. I was still the invisible intern, carrying files no one else wanted to touch. But in my mind, I was already playing the game. Every number I read, every conversation I overheard, I stored it like treasure. And then, one day, opportunity whispered my name. A small company in the energy sector caught my eye. It wasn't glamorous. In fact, most analysts at the firm dismissed it entirely. But I had been watching it for weeks. I studied its reports, tracked its debt, looked at its earnings, and something inside me told me it was undervalued. I didn't have much money, barely enough to survive. But I scraped together every dollar I could spare and made the leap. At first, nothing happened. The stock crawled slowly, barely moving. My colleagues laughed when they heard what I had chosen. "Kid, that company's dead money," one of them said. "Better luck next time." But I stayed patient. And then, almost like fate rewarding my discipline, the company announced a major new contract. Overnight, the stock jumped 10%, then 20%, then 30%. Within weeks, my small stake had doubled. For the first time in my life, I felt what it meant to win. Really win. That victory lit a fire in me. Suddenly, the hunger of my childhood, the discipline of my teenage years, all of it crystallized into proof. I could do this. I could read numbers better than most. I could see what others overlooked. But with success comes a dangerous companion: arrogance. The praise started coming, small at first. One trader clapped me on the back. "Nice pick, kid," he said. Another joked, "Maybe you'll be running this place one day." They meant it lightly, but I let the words sink into my chest like prophecy. I began to believe I had cracked the code, that I had some gift others didn't, and that belief, more than anything else, nearly destroyed me. Flush with confidence, I began taking risks I wasn't ready for. Bigger bets, faster moves, companies I didn't fully understand. I told myself I was being bold. In truth, I was being reckless. At first, the wins continued. Another stock climbed. Another gamble paid off. My tiny account began to look larger than I had ever dreamed. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving New York. I was tasting its wealth. I upgraded my suit, bought myself a decent watch, ate at restaurants instead of surviving on peanut butter. I started to feel like I belonged. But the market has a way of humbling those who forget its rules. It happened suddenly. A stock I had poured nearly all my money into collapsed. Bad earnings, worse outlook, and overnight my gains evaporated. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the numbers on the screen, my throat dry, my hands shaking. The very same traders who once clapped my back now smirked. One of them said, "Told you the kid was just lucky." They were right. In my arrogance, I had forgotten the lessons that built me: patience, research, margin of safety. I had traded them all for speed and pride. By the end of that week, I had lost nearly everything I had made. My savings shrank to almost nothing. I couldn't afford my rent. I had to skip meals again, just like the days of my childhood. Those were dark nights. I lay awake in my tiny apartment, listening to the radiator clank like a cruel reminder of my failure. Fear whispered, "It's over, Jordan. You're not cut out for this. Go home. Be normal." For a moment, I almost believed it. But then, I remembered that greasy newspaper from my childhood. I remembered the boy who traced numbers with his finger, dreaming of freedom. I couldn't betray him. Not now. Not ever. So I swallowed my pride, picked up my notebooks, and went back to the basics. I reread Graham. I reread Buffett. I reminded myself why I had started. Not for quick wins, not for applause, but for independence, for freedom. That failure became my second great teacher. It taught me that the market is not kind. It doesn't care about your dreams, your hunger, or your ambition. It rewards discipline and punishes arrogance. It also taught me something deeper. Wealth is not about how much you gain when you win, but how much you survive when you lose. I realized that if I could endure this fall, if I could rise from nothing again, then nothing could stop me. That was my first big win and my first brutal fall. It hurt, it humbled me, but it also prepared me. Because every empire, before it rises, must be broken once. And I was ready to rebuild stronger than ever. Failure has a way of either burying you or building you. For me, that loss, the one that nearly sent me back home in shame, became the soil where something new took root. I stopped chasing shortcuts. I stopped worshiping speed. I stripped myself down to the basics and asked the question that would define my life. What is money really for? The answer came slowly, like dawn breaking through fog. Money wasn't about quick wins or proving people wrong. Money was a tool, one that could buy freedom, security, and legacy, but only if it was used with discipline. So I began building a philosophy. I told myself, never invest in something you don't understand. Never risk more than you can afford to lose. Never let emotions dictate your moves. And above all, patience beats brilliance. These weren't just rules. They were survival codes. I carved them into my notebooks like commandments, repeating them until they became second nature. During this time, I also began to change how I saw people. In the early days, I envied the men in suits, the ones flashing wealth like trophies. But after watching them longer, I noticed something. Many of them weren't truly rich. They lived for appearances, drowning in debt, gambling on risky trades just to look important. I realized true wealth was quiet. It didn't need to shout. It didn't need to flash. It grew slowly, silently, like a tree with roots so deep no storm could uproot it. That became my goal, not just to get rich, but to build wealth that couldn't be destroyed. It was around this time that people began to notice me. At first, it was small. A colleague overheard me explaining a company's balance sheet better than one of the senior analysts. Another asked me why I chose to avoid a stock everyone else was hyping, and weeks later, when it collapsed, they remembered my warning. Whispers started. The kid sees things differently. For the first time, I wasn't just the invisible intern. I was the outsider with ideas worth listening to. I didn't have money yet. Not real money, but I had something more valuable: credibility. And credibility, in the world of Wall Street, is the currency that buys opportunity. I began to share my thoughts more openly, not as predictions, but as philosophies. I told anyone who would listen, wealth is not built in a sprint. It is built in a marathon. If you want fast money, go gamble in Las Vegas. If you want a legacy, plant seeds and wait. Some laughed. Some dismissed me. But just a few leaned in closer. Looking back now, I see that this was the turning point. This was when Jordan, the poor boy with hand-me-down shoes, began to transform into Jordan, the investor with a vision. It wasn't the billions. It wasn't the fame. Not yet. But it was the spark, the beginning of something bigger than me. And so, as I close this chapter, I leave you with this thought. Every tycoon starts as a nobody. Every empire begins as a whisper. My whisper had finally been heard, but what came next was louder than anything I could have imagined. This was just the first part of my journey from poverty to my first philosophies on money. But the story doesn't end here. In the next episode, I'll reveal how one forgotten investment, a company nobody cared about, became the first true cornerstone of my fortune. So subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join me in the next chapter of Legacy of a Tycoon. The story has only just begun.